Welcome to today's webinar, which is jointly hosted by ISEA and CPIT. Today we have Willis Jensen, who will be speaking about understanding and addressing complexity and problem solving. Willis leads the HR analytics team at WL Gore and Associates, where he helps solve business problems across the globe with data. He previously worked as a statistician and led the global statistics team at Gore. He holds degrees in statistics from Brigham Young University and a PhD in statistics from Virginia Tech. He is a member of the editorial board for the Journal of Quality Technology and previously served as associate editor of Technometrics and is a member of the editorial board of Quality Engineering. He is a winner of the Schul Award, which is given at the Fall Technical Conference, and a winner of the Nelson and Bisgard Awards from ASQ and is an ASQ Fellow. So just to handle a little bit of logistics during the presentation, if you have questions, please use the questions or chat functionality in the GoToWebinar. And with that, I will turn things over to you, Willis.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that introduction, and it's great to have many of you on there. I wish I could see all the faces from everyone that is participating. It looks like we're getting close to about 100 of you on this webinar, so super exciting to see that. I'm going to try to make this interactive as part of what we do. I would love to be able to do this in person and have 100 of you in the room and feel the energy in the room with that. But we'll do our best to do this virtually. If you do have a question and want to put something in the chat or a comment, whatever, please do that throughout. I'll take those questions throughout in the moment. I would prefer to answer those as we're talking about that topic, if there are questions and comments, rather than waiting until the end of this hour that we have together. I do want to acknowledge my two co-authors who helped with this topic. This has been an interesting collaboration with Roger Hurl and Juran Damast around this topic. And I really started a few years ago in asking a question around complexity and what are the tools and things that we have to address complexity. And it started with Roger and I, and we had a discussion, we had a conversation, and we decided to write that up and put it together into a paper. We submitted the paper and we got some feedback, some very excellent feedback from one of the reviewers in this paper. And we decided to take, this was Roger's great idea, and to say, well, what if this person, this reviewer, obviously knows what they're talking about, and they are could add a great perspective to this paper. So what if we talk to the editor and ask them to join us as a co-author to the paper so that we could bring in this additional perspective? That turned out to be Juran, and so we were super excited to have Juran join this collaboration, and well, a lot of what you see is also part of that feedback from him and perspectives that he brings to this. So a bit of a mix of industry and academia in here. I will share, based on my own experiences working at Gore. I've been at Gore 16 years now, and I've been able to see a lot of complex problems, a lot of complex situations, and I'll try to bring in some of those stories and examples as part of them. But before we get into what I want to talk about here, I want to, again, make this interactive and understand a little bit. So if you're at a computer, if you're at a device, you could open up that device and go to menti.com and put in this code 34871320. And we're going to do a little bit of interactive polling as part of this. So I'm going to switch my screen over here and start this. All right, so menti.com, use that code 34871320 and answer this question. Which area best describes your role? Are you in academia, industry, government, or consulting? And let's see how the responses shape up here. Right. And as you do that, keep that device open or keep that screen open, because we're going to be asking you a number of other questions throughout as part of this. So don't close it just yet. My response is a pretty clear majority here from industry. Looks like with about half of you responding, we're at 41, 42 in industry, a couple in academia, 5 in government, some in consulting as well. So that's great to hear, great to see. So I do come from industry. I'm going to make this as practical as possible. This is not going to be a theoretical treatment of complexity. So hopefully that will resonate for a lot of you here in the audience. I'm going to go to the next question. So this webinar is being sponsored by some different organizations. You could select which organizations that you're a part of. If you're a member of all of them, select all 4 of them. We wanted to get a sense of maybe a background again of those who are attending. Great. I know it was shared with a variety of different venues and organizations, so I was curious to see what the marketing success was for those different communication channels and where this webinar was advertised. It looks like we had a pretty good mix there of the ASQ CPID as well as ISEA, which are the 2 primary sponsors. But I know it got shared with some of the ASA sections as well. And then it looks like a few of you are members of multiple of these organizations, so that's great. Great to see as well. Okay. All right. And then one more question, initial question that I would like to ask. Going back to this topic of around a complex problem. So think back to your own experiences, the most complex problem that you've been involved with, and type in a word or a phrase that comes to mind. Just what's that initial reaction or feeling or thought when you were in that complex? And let's see what this word cloud gives us. All right. Get a lot of great words, initial things in here. Okay, so it's like confusing, overwhelming. There's some common words in there, but bad communication, unstructured, lack of knowledge, no solution, chaotic, frustrated, incomplete. You hear the negativity associated with a lot of these. Never-ending, overwhelmed, data overload, no clear objective, disbelief, messy. It's very negative, right? And when we think about complex problems, we have this negative association with it, with a lot of these words in here. And I don't think that's what we're trying to address today, is how do we overcome some of that negativity associated with complex problems, and how do we tackle those types of problems, and what are some things that we can do to address that and make the situation a little bit more positive situation. So a lot of great words and great pieces in there. So let me switch back over here, and let's dive into some of this. But first off, we do have a paper that was in quality engineering, the 3 of us. So this has a ton of details, a great paper. I know I'm biased being an author on the paper. I'm not going to rehash everything that's in that paper. You can go in there and look for more details. There's some examples and a framework. I'm going to pull out some of the highlights of that I'll share in here, but there's a lot of great content in there. And that's where the basis for what I'm sharing today. So let's talk about, what do we mean by complex problems? When we talk about simple problems, we talk about y's and x's, and we know the relationship between those y's and x's. So we talk about things like a Six Sigma method or a DMAIC methodology that makes it very easy. Okay, I'm trying to increase the yield of a process. I have a very clear objective, and I'm able to do that. When we start thinking into things that are more complex, we start getting into maybe the objective isn't as clear, maybe it's a challenge to model that relationship, maybe there's a lot of different opinions, maybe we don't have the data associated with it, and then we get people associated with all of those things. That would be great if everything could be reduced to an equation. With people are a little more challenging to reduce to an equation because they have different perceptions and opinions and goals and objectives, and how do you bring all of that together within an organization? And so the more that you get closer to people and opinions and things like that, away from like simple physics or mathematical equations or whatever it may be, the more complex those problems get. So the way we describe this is we propose a framework that has different dimensions and elements that are part of this complexity. When we originally did this, we did this kind of as a linear form, and one of the big things, ahas, that we learned is that it's not always linear. These elements don't necessarily go in order. They can happen at different phases in a project or a work effort to tackle those. So we're going to walk through each of these in detail, each of these different elements. So let's start with the first, with the problem. So I'm going to kind of take them in an order around that circle, which maybe is a common order, but they don't necessarily always happen in that order. So let's go back to our Menti poll and tackle another question. So what is it that makes it hard to define the right problem? If you just put a quick answer, bullet point, or a word or a phrase associated with that. So we got politics, we got conflicting priorities, unclear objectives, context, lack of data, good, scope, lack of knowledge, you don't know what you're trying to do, many stakeholders, what parameters are important, opinions, different viewpoints of the effects, causes, opinions, scope, not having all the factors, ambiguity, different stakeholders, conflicting goals, different opinions, not enough information, asking the right question, actions, good, lack of information, lack of communication, definitions, assumptions, a framework for a solution, unknown unknowns, I like that one, I think it's one, unknown, we don't know what we don't know. As part of that, all the input variables not known, perspectives, biases, complexity, everyone has a theory. These are great. These are all great things. You start to see these different things that make it challenging for doing them. So let me tell a story and an example of a situation I was in related to a problem. So I'm in an HR analytics team, and this was a new team. This team has been around for a few years. And when we had this idea to start this team around HR analytics, I had spent 12 years as a statistician, and I was looking to do something different. I wanted to increase my impact as a statistician and get closer to the business in this area. And I'd been doing some work in the area. So we went to the HR leadership team and said, let's try an experiment. And we got a team. We put together a team of 4 people that had different skill sets, and we thought had the right mix of skill sets, and said, give us 6 months to show you what we can do with our people data. And so it ended up being a very complex problem. And the problem being, how do we increase data-driven decision-making? We started and we had data, we could do stuff, but sometimes you had to get into how do people take action on it. This isn't a first or natural inclination for HR people to be data-driven. When I was working with engineers, that was a much more natural thing. And I had to change the language that I was speaking with those folks in HR. And how do we get this new mindset, a new way of thinking within a function or an area with people where that was not their norm. We also had other dimensions around the data, incomplete data, messy data, fragmented data sources, not really understanding the value that we could bring with the data, inadequate technology. We were a smaller team and limited resources, so a lot of things going in trying to build this HR analytics team. But one of the biggest problems that we had right at the beginning was too many problems to tackle. There were so many places where we weren't using data, so many questions that we can answer with the data, that it was hard to say, well, what do we go after? And you think about a low-hanging fruit on a tree. It was like this tree was just overloaded with low-hanging fruit, and there was so much that we could do in there. So how do we decide? Well, our leadership team actually wasn't very helpful with that. They didn't know. This was new for them. How can we use the data? They didn't know. So in some sense, we couldn't really get input or a prioritization from our leadership team to say, hey, yeah, go tackle these are the most important problems. So the solution is we did do some of that consulting with the HR leadership team and consulting, but really it was just, don't try to optimize and do this full-blown prioritization. Just start working on something. Just move forward. Start picking fruit. And don't worry about whether you're getting the lowest hanging fruit on the tree. If it's something that you can reach, something you can do, start picking. And if it's something you need a ladder for to get some of the other stuff, leave those ones for further down the road. But it was really, don't get paralyzed in having too much work to do and start picking something, and don't rely on somebody else too much to decide that for you. Now, 4 years later, we have a high functioning team. We're adding a lot of value, increasing visibility and success. It didn't take very long into that 6 months before it was like, oh no, we need you guys, we want you guys. And I'm part of the regular HR leadership team meetings, helping out in this prioritization process, planning process, and really having a huge impact on the data decisions that are influencing all of the organization. So second dimension, data access, structure, and quality. When we think about simple, in this case, we think about data that's a random sample, satisfies all of those statistical assumptions, IID type data in there, versus more complex data collection where you have inconsistent variables, you have missing values, you have typos, you have outliers. And we think about the textbook type data versus the real world data. Real world data is complex. And one of the tools that has been super valuable for me that I didn't really get as a statistician is data modeling. I'm not talking about statistical modeling. I'm talking about how you connect and link different data sources together. As a statistician, previously, my thought was always trying to get that one big data set, join everything together into one big data set and do your analysis off of that. When it comes to data modeling, you can handle that complexity with star schemas and relational fields between things. And there's some books, there's one example of a book. But I started getting into this topic because of the nature of the data that we were working with HR. And this has been a lifesaver for us, is understanding data modeling and really being able to leverage that and use that to address the complexity that is in there. So let's go to the next question here. All right, so what's the typical amount of time in data analysis spent in cleaning and preparing the data? And you use your own experience and make an average. I know sometimes it might be more or less, but I'm going to give a typical or an average value here. All right. And for those of you that are down in that 0 to 20%, let me just say I'm jealous. I'm really jealous. I wish it was that way for me all the time. For the rest of us, many of us are in that 61+%. Even if it's in that 41, that's still half of your time in there. So definitely a little bit right skewed on this distribution on the higher side, 60 to 80% in there. And then a little bit of a mix across different things. So my question then, when we think about the complexity in there, why is that number so high? Why do people say 60% or 80%? This is the part that we don't like. If we're a data scientist or a statistician or a data analyst, you want to be able to just jump in and have fun playing with and exploring this data. If I think about what the root cause is, my answer is complexity, right? And so if you know that there's complexity in that, and that's the complexity comes from different data systems, different definitions, and the way the data is structured, the way the data is organized. So my challenge to you is, are you going to keep living with that complexity, or are you going to do something to address that complexity? And this is actually something I've spent a lot more time on the last few years in my role, is partnering with IT, partnering with data architects on our team. We have a data engineer, we're hiring for another data engineer. And these data engineers help us with this complexity. They help us to bring that data together so that we're not spending as much time on this cleaning and preparation. We're building out data flows, automating those data flows, automating that manipulation, transformation, cleaning, merging, integration of all of those different data sources. And that's where we've actually spent more of our time as a team up front to address that complexity so that we can do the analysis and the reports and the dashboards and the modeling and everything that we want to do with that data. If you find yourself in that situation, doing a lot of cleaning, think about where that's coming from, think about that complexity, and think about how you can address that complexity in the data. So an analogy, some of you may have seen something like this out there, and how the data fits together, and there's different steps of collection, analysis, and the analogy to Legos, and how we're putting those Legos together in there. There's a great website here, Effective Data Storytelling. Brent Dykes has written a great book about this data storytelling process and how you bring that data together to really communicate insights and actions that need to be taken by those that are using the data. Highly recommend it. If you're working with data, it's like putting together Legos. When we talk about data gaps, it's because we don't have colors. Maybe we're missing the blues or the yellows or the reds, and it makes it hard for me to tell that story if I'm missing colors. Maybe we manually have to sort those Legos to really pull them in different places. There's technology in there that can automate a lot of that. Maybe it's the poor data architecture. Maybe it's after we build out something and then we pull all the Legos apart and we dump them into a big bin, and then I have to go back and manually resort all those Legos again to build the next data story. And then sometimes we have different needs. Sometimes people are really good at working with Legos, and they just want the Legos organized and sorted in a good way so that they can quickly build a story that they are trying to tell. And other times, they don't even want to touch the Legos. They want you to build everything for them. So just recognizing those different needs and customers and familiarity with the data has been helpful for our team to try to figure out how to help and meet those different needs. So that's data access. Let's go into analysis methods. Actually, on second thought, I'm not going to go much further on complexity and analysis. And the reason why 90% of the statistics literature is focused on this dimension. And it doesn't need any more attention. We talk about complex modeling and all of these things for dealing with complex data. There's plenty of stuff out there. You can go to any statistics journal or things like that and get all of the latest and greatest complex analysis methods. So let's jump to decision making. Next question here on decision making. So why is it so hard for organizations to make decisions? And just a word or a quick phrase in there. All right, ego. Again, a word, politics. Another word, uncertainty, fear of mistakes. Too many cooks in the kitchen, silos. Right? Nobody wants to be responsible. lack of empowerment, politics, micromanagement, no options, right? Wrong voices in the room, balancing, so getting the right people in there, not knowing the problem, unclear objectives, not enough data, experiences, trying to boil the ocean, trying to solve all the world's problems. Great. Evaluating the impact, the cost, right? Competing needs, legacies, yeah, different opinions, fear of responsibility, accountability, too many options. I like that one. Sometimes we get so many options in there and people get paralyzed in that. If you go to the grocery store and you see 25 kinds of toothpaste, how do I know which toothpaste to pick? Sometimes it's easier to just have 3 kinds to pick from, right? Many options, great. Unclear requirements, misaligned objectives, slow moving, too cheap, right? Not willing to put the investment or the time to whatever get to get the data or whatever it may be to make that decision. Hidden agendas, absolutely. Politics, okay? Cost, not enough data, fear, posturing, lack of communication. Who, right? How do we even know who is the decision maker? Do we define that? We find that paralysis. Good. Different needs. This is how we've always done it. Great. Yeah, I've absolutely seen that. It's, people are that inertia. How do you overcome that inertia? The who, management style, uncertainty. These are all great answers. Can agree on assumptions, different opinions. Awesome. So these are all great things. So great input from the rest of you on decision. When we talk about decision making, so there's simple decisions, like if you know your Y's and your X's and you can put an equation on something, you can optimize things. There's optimization functions and tools that allow us to address that. But when you get into complex problems, now you might have multiple objectives. Maybe it's not just a simple optimization problem. Maybe there's many dimensions in there because of those multiple objectives. As you start thinking about what are some of the tools that you might have in there, and there's a lot of great literature that's coming out in here. I don't know how many of you have seen Pareto Fronts is a great tool. Christine Anderson Cook. If you don't know that, look her up. Pareto Fronts is a great tool for balancing competing objectives. And start getting into simulations or ways to be able to simulate those problems. So I'll give you another example or a story related to decision making. So we had a known data gap that we were trying to address in our function. We had a relatively simple solution. There was a vendor out there that was able to address that problem. I thought we had a great business case and was taking it to make the investment. But it turned out there were at least 12 people involved in this decision-making process. Some of those were new people who I couldn't actually get everybody into the same room at the same time because they were in different regions and time zones. And there was lack of clarity. And the reason why there was 12 was because the leader had left and they hadn't had a replacement. And so we tried to make this decision by committee, if you will. And so the answer to that I got was no, you can't make that investment, don't do it. All right. And I was kind of disappointed in there because we weren't able to address this gap. So I learned a couple of lessons from that experience. Sometimes one of those lessons is if I had just gone ahead and done it without talking to the committee, I don't think anybody would have known what had happened, right? And sometimes it's better to just decide and do something rather than wait for somebody else to make a decision for you. Now, if you're in a situation where you do know who is the decision maker, then you obviously need to do that. I'm not encouraging anyone to be like rebellious or whatever, but sometimes we have more power than we think. Sometimes we have more opportunities to make decisions. If we wait for other people to do it, we may never get anywhere. And the flip side of that is if you are a leader, you should be doing everything you can to empower people to make decisions for themselves. So the people that are closest with the most knowledge, most experience are able to make decisions. And that's the sign of a great leader in my perspective, is people that don't control all the decisions, but they give as much of that and delegate that to other people to be able to do it. And they feel like they can make that decision, they can make the mistakes associated with that. All right. So let's now go to solution deployment. When we talk about simple solutions, sometimes it's very straightforward and say, okay, here's what you got to do to implement that. But in reality, there are a lot of things that can get in the way of deploying solutions, and that has to do with humans being humans, right? Maybe they don't know how to implement it, maybe they don't care about it, maybe they don't understand the reason for it. And there's this whole field of change management. And if you want some great books of literature, there's one example here, Leading Change, John Cotter. Just do a quick search on change management and you'll find all kinds of tools and resources and help to address how do we deploy solutions and how do we do that. I'll give you an example from my own experience related to this. So I was part of a process improvement team. I was fresh out of school and super excited to solve problems. I had spent 2 years as a Six Sigma coach, so I knew a lot of Six Sigma stuff, and I was ready to apply this into a project here at Gore. We had a project to improve yields at a manufacturing plant. So we had it all. The leadership team, the plant leader was there, supportive. We had a clear problem. There was a financial gain clearly from this. We had a qualified team together that had the tools and the experience in doing this. But the output of that project was really nothing of value. So what was it that got in the way? It was solution deployment. We could come up with solutions, come up with ideas, but I had no experience with implementing change in a quality system. And it was a regulated environment and quality system. I had never done anything like that before. So we could come up with all the great ideas and the data and everything, but how do you drive that change into a quality system? Looking back on that experience, if I know now what if I knew then what I know now, I think it would probably be a different story. And the opportunity passed at that point in time. So don't neglect that solution deployment. And the last one that I want to talk about is organizational complexity. And this is something that permeates all of these other dimensions in here. So the simple view on organizations is that they are rational, they're logical, everybody's committed to the same goals, and it's easy to align all of your strategies, your objectives, and actions based on that vision and that goal. In reality, organizations are complex. And as soon as you get two people together, you get complexity because you have two different perspectives, two different backgrounds, and whatnot. And then multiply that by 10 or 20 or 100 or 1,000 or 10,000, and you start to see the large amount of complexity in there. And you start bringing in different experiences, languages. So in my role, I work with people in Asia and Europe and all different areas of the US. And it creates a lot of complexity to be able to work cross-regionally across the globe as part of that, and understanding different cultural backgrounds that people have. All right, so next question here. So what are some examples that you have seen of organizational complexity? Again, just throw a word or a phrase in there. Okay, starting to see great examples of silos, organizational structures, matrix organization, and we talk about the matrix and all that. And that's great for different reasons, but it can create issues. It can create complexity in there, right? Local changes versus global interaction, multiple geographical locations, systems, multiple systems, absolutely. If you're trying to work across different systems, too many vice presidents, right? No balance, silos, incompatible systems, no trust. Right? So that human element of it is actually very important. And do people trust each other? Do they connect with each other? Are they communicating? Right? Departments run as feuding kingdoms, right? So if each of those silos has their own objectives, it's no wonder it's going to be challenging to get everybody to work toward the same objective. Too many levels, right? Different masters. 30 steps and 5 forms to get a pen. I like that. Age of automation, not updating the old with the new. Great, great. Rapid changes, too many changes. Yeah, absolutely. So it can be the inertia side, or not changing quickly enough with the times, and there can be the flip side of changing too often, right? Getting that flavor of the month, and every time a leader changes, you get a new mission and strategy, and that's hard to keep up with that complexity. Too many bosses that have different perspectives. Absolutely. Great. These are all great examples of organizational complexity. Right. All right. So another story from my experience related to this. And I did a presentation on this at one of the ISEA meetings. So you can get this whole presentation at the ISEA-Change.org. They've got a lot of great resources there around statistical engineering. And in the particular summit, I talk about this in full detail. I'm just going to give you a little bit of highlights associated with this one. So in this situation, we were implementing a new way of recognizing, ranking, and paying people. Their organization was about 10,000 associates. And so it's a pretty significant change. People care about their pay, right? They're invested in this. This matters to them. You have 10,000 different opinions associated with this. And in this project that we implemented with this new ways, I give credit to our project champion. I was just a team member on this. There was some data involved in it, but this project champion was amazing. Thinking about this project and change management, and every time we had a meeting, every time we had a conversation, say, okay, what's the impact? What are people going to think about this? What are they going to say about this? How do we communicate this? How do we make sure that they know and understand what's happening? How do they know what their role is in part of this new process? So we were many forms of communication. Sometimes it's really easy to assume, say, if you send out an email, well, everybody knows. But turns out, and we've done some tracking on some of this, that some of our emails, they're open 30% of the time, and people have flooded full email boxes. They don't read everything, and even if they do open it, sometimes they're just skimming, and so they may not necessarily get the message that you have in there. So you have to have many forms of communication. You have to be repetitive, and it may feel repetitive from your side because you're communicating. It's like I've told people 12 times, but the people on the other end really haven't heard it 12 times because they haven't necessarily gotten all of these. So we had plant meetings, we had webinars, we had online brain sharks that were communicating the change. We built documents, FAQ documents that people could read on their own. We had an intranet. We had groups of ambassadors, people who were appointed to answer questions in the local plants and areas to be able to do it. And we did emails as well. But we just have many modes of communication. You have to over communicate anytime you have a change of this magnitude that impacts everyone in there. So the organizational complexity, now 5 years later, we've been doing this process. And in those 5 years, we've lost people, we've hired people. And even though I've been involved in this project for 5 years and I know this process inside and out, that person that we just hired 2 months ago doesn't have any idea, doesn't have any of that history. And so we can't just communicate once and be done with it. We have to be constantly repeating that message, that communication over and over again. And think about those new people coming in, think about their perspective. And they haven't heard this, they don't know this. And again, it feels repetitive, but that's the way to address that complexity. It's communication. Okay. So now, having talked through each of these different dimensions, well, now let's get into the how do we address this complexity. So for each of these different areas, there are bodies of literature in all of these areas. And it's not just a statistics literature or data science literature. There's a lot of different areas. There's whole disciplines around this decision making, around solution deployment, around organizations, around data access, problem definition. So you really got to pay attention to all of those different pieces of literature. If you really want to be able to understand and be someone who can solve those complex problems, it requires you to be a little more broad in your skill set. Broad, or in the absence of one person, which, I mean, it would be impossible for one person to be an expert in all of these areas. So how do we address it? Teams. You bring in those small teams, you bring in that mix of skill sets that are looking in all of those different areas, all of those different elements and dimensions to be able to tackle those. And statistical engineering is actually a great approach and solution for solving complex problems. And this is just right out of the ISEA handbook. There's different steps associated with that, with the different feedback loops. I'm not going to teach you statistical engineering. You can go to the website and they've got a lot of great resources there on what is statistical engineering, examples and case studies and papers and whatnot for doing that. Okay. I think this is my last question. You have been great in participating in here. So in one word, what is the root cause of complexity? Language, uncertainty, human behavior. Yeah, those darn humans, right? We talk about there, individuals, people, reality, just reality. This is the world that we live in. It's going to be complex. Sometimes it feels like it's getting more and more complex. All right, great. These are all great words. Some of you did more than one word, so shame on you. Didn't follow instructions very well. Interdependency, dimensions, relationships, correlations, chaos, diversity. All right, wanting to be perfect, variety, non-clear. Somebody put a whole sentence. All right. Individual workarounds, so workarounds that do it, but not following the process and not having established processes. All right, great. These are all great answers in here. But we're gonna give you my answer to this. It would be constraints. Nobody got that answered. I don't see that on there. Why constraints? When I think about constraints, constraints are the same thing as assumptions. Every time we assume something, we make an assumption, we're putting that constraint on the problem, on the scope. It's not necessarily bad, it's just recognize that every time you make additional assumptions, you're adding to constraints, you are increasing the complexity. And it's those constraints and assumptions that we make that get in the way of our communication, get in the way of defining problems, they get in the way of considering different solutions, and they get in the way of implementing solutions. All right, so if you think about the constraints and how can I remove constraints, the more you can remove those, the more, the less complexity that you will have in a situation to be able to address. All right, and sometimes they're not even that visible. When you're having a conversation, if you've ever been in that situation, we all have, you're talking with someone and you feel like they're talking over their head, they're not getting what you're saying, you're not getting what they're saying, and it's because of those underlying assumptions. And if you can get deeper into the conversation to understand what is the assumption that that person is making, what is the background and the context. When they say that word, and you hear that word, it may not necessarily mean the same thing to them as it does to you. And so sometimes you have to go back and challenge that assumption to say, okay, what do you mean by that word or that phrase, or whatever it may be, right? And get to that, then find that common ground, and then allows you to address the constraints, because sometimes those assumptions are not real, sometimes they're perceived, sometimes they're made up, and that's where you can have a real meaningful dialogue in understanding those assumptions. And this was something when I first started at Gore, I had a sponsor, a mentor. This was something that he taught me, and I'll be forever grateful to him for that. It's like, what is the assumption? What is the question you're trying to answer? And he coached me and pushed me to say, you've got to get down and really understand this to be an effective statistician, to be an effective consultant. And so working with these engineers that I was working with at the time, they would come in and say, this is what I'm trying to do. And I'd have to kind of say, and I would even just do it and make fun of, kind of be vulnerable and say, hey, I'm the dumb statistician. I have no idea what your process is. Start from the dumb statistician view, who doesn't understand your process, and do that. And what I found more often than not is that by going back and questioning some of those assumptions, I would find out I would be able to open up different ways of thinking. And because people would get narrow-minded and say, well, they started somewhere and they've gone down this path of this journey and they think this is what the answer is. And if I could get them to back up a few steps in their thought process, we could understand, oh, well, actually, that might not be true, or actually, here's another way to think about it, and it could get them on another path and get them onto other solutions that would help solve a problem or a situation in them associated with that. Right? So when you think about constraints, that also gives some other ideas of how to address complexity. So one is removing or relaxing constraints. Each time you add a constraint, you're going to increase the complexity of the problem. Right? If I had a situation where I had unlimited budget, unlimited resources, unlimited time, I could solve any problem, right? As soon as I say, well, you only have 6 months, or you only have this budget, or you only have this number of people, or you have to meet these types of needs, the more of those you put, the more complex the problem gets, and the more challenging the problem gets. So as soon as you can try to relax some of those, remove them entirely, sometimes they're just perceptions in our mind. Be explicit about the assumptions is number 2. List them out. Like, what is it that people are assuming? What's the scope that we're talking about with this problem? That's part of that problem definition piece that we were talking about in there, so that you can get a chance. I know it's cliche to say think outside the box, but there's some truth to that, and it's related to assumptions and constraints and being able to relax those. And the last one in there is just question. Is that real? Is that assumption real? Do I really have to rely on that person to make a decision, for an example? Or can I move forward and do something, right? Is that person really blocking my progress in there? Or is it they just don't understand, right? Are they really my enemy on something, right? Sometimes those constraints and assumptions and things that we make, and this, I've done a lot of learning in this area. I'm not an expert by any means, but we talk about our unconscious biases and things that we do. I'm in HR, right? So I work with a lot of people in HR who've been teaching me a lot about this, and this unconscious bias that we do and the assumptions that we make about people based on the way they look and what they say and what they do, and all of those interactions that we have with real human beings. And sometimes those constraints aren't real. Sometimes they're just perceptions. And the more we can step back from that, the more we can address some of those challenges. Right. So one last story that I want to share, and I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but maybe there's others in there, illustrate the constraints. So a little while ago, I had an opportunity. I live in Flagstaff, Arizona. I had an opportunity to travel to Elkton, Maryland, which is where GORE's headquarters are, on a temporary assignment. It's 2,000 miles away. And at the time, I had a family of 8. So I had 6 kids, ages 2 to 12. And there's a picture at the time. We could not find a place to live for 3 months in the summer. And just having 6 kids, that qualifies as a complex problem. And how to hope and be a good dad to 6 kids there. So we were looking into apartments, and the company had some company apartments, but they were just too small. They talked about, well, maybe get 2 apartments side by side, but we didn't feel comfortable about that, and having like small kids sleeping in one apartment and us sleeping in another apartment. We could find a house to rent, but they were very expensive, and we only had, you see the constraints in there, right? I can't spend too much money. I've got to have a place that fits 8 people and all of it. So we struggled for a little while, and for a while we thought, oh, this isn't going to happen because we can't find a place to do it. So I started to think about the assumption. So the assumption that I was making in this situation is that I needed a bed for every person in my family. And so when I was doing all of these online searches and apartments and houses for rent and Airbnbs, I was looking everywhere to try to find something. And I was looking for 8 beds, right? And that severely limited the scope of what was available. In reality, I didn't need 8 beds. I just needed a place for everyone to sleep, right? And so what I did is I started relaxing that assumption. I looked at 6 bedroom or 6 bed places or 5 bed places to try to see, well, what's something that's a little bit less? And it turned out that we were able to find a small home rental that had beds for 6. We drove out there. We went to the local Walmart, got a couple of cheap mattresses, stored them under the beds, the existing beds that were in this house, and we gave them away at the end of the summer so that we were able to make that work. So we were able to kind of solve this complex problem. My youngest kids, they didn't care whether it was a mattress on the floor or an actual bed. They were just excited to be together with the family and have a great time together. And we were able to find something that met the price requirements. But it was challenging those assumptions and thinking about those assumptions. And my kids still to this day talk about that awesome summer that we spent in Maryland. Every weekend we were going out, New York City, Philadelphia, DC, the beach, and all of these great things and adventures that we got to have over the summer because we were able to make that work and overcome those constraints that we thought we had in this problem. So again, a bit of a personal story, but just an example of how you relax those assumptions. So with that, that's what I have here for today. I don't know if there's other questions that anybody would like to ask at this point.
Hi, Willis. Thank you. So we did have, I guess, a couple of comments, and that maybe a comment and then a question. So we did have a comment that constraints and assumptions are used to limit complexity, not to cause complexity. So can you maybe comment on that?
Yeah. So there are situations where we can simplify a problem. I think is maybe around that is what I'm hearing in there to say, you know, I'm going to focus on trying to solve a problem for this area that makes it a little bit easier. But then at some point, I'm going to have to figure out how do I expand that out to make that problem work. Maybe not just for one plant or one process, but many plants or many processes. So sometimes we will do those. We put some constraints around there, but it limits the impact of that. If I solve the problem for one process or one building or one plant or one type of thing, I think that's maybe kind of where that question is coming from. Is that sometimes it helps to scope things down so that you can get a handle around the problem in there. But in terms of being able to solve a complex problem, it's got to be something that works across multiple processes, multiple plants, multiple shifts, or I'm thinking of a manufacturing context, but it's true for an organizational complex context. If I'm trying to solve a problem that impacts the entire organization, there's a lot of things that it's got to work for that language or that region or that division or that department or that area. And that's what makes it complex is those constraints. But we can certainly try to think about how do we relax those or bring those in to get a solution, but then I've got to make a solution robust. And this is where there's a lot of great statistical literature, I think, in terms of robust design or trying to find those noise factors or controllable factors or trying to find factors that work well across a variety of situations. To me, that's relaxing assumptions. It's like I don't have to have, it doesn't matter what setting I put that other factor. If I put this really nice influential factor at one setting and I get a good result across that's robust across a variety of situations, that to me is relaxing the constraint. I'm not required to do it versus this more optimal type thing, well, I have to have all of those settings just right. And again, I'm kind of talking general there, but I think that's a great point in thinking about how do you go back and forth between those assumptions to get robust, broadly applicable solutions versus local solutions. I think the more we can get to those robust, broad, holistic type solutions, the more we can increase impact, right? The more value we can bring as opposed to solving sub-optimizing in a local situation. And I think that's where a lot of our problems come, is that we have a lot of people sub-optimizing. They're scoping it down, and we really need to be thinking more broadly.
Okay, and it looks like we have a few more questions about constraints. So I had one question about, okay, how do you go about removing or relaxing a constraint? And I've got another question about, do you have recommendations for references on studying constraints?
Yeah, one of the great classical ones, references is theory of constraint. And I'm drawing a blank on the name now. TOC, theory of constraints. There's a number of books in there related to that. I might have to come back and throw that in there, but there's a great book in there, and it's told as a parable style story of every guy is thinking about those different constraints and talking about bottlenecks and thinking about the yield of our process and thinking about where's the bottleneck and where can you get the biggest gain in a process improvement. So there's certainly literature around that related to that that's relevant in there. I think even just some of the literature on bias, non-statistical, non-technical literature on unconscious bias. I would do some research on that term and think about what is that communication. And again, this is something I'm getting from an HR world. It's going to the HR literature. Right? There's plenty of it in there about assumptions and bias, and some of it is rooted in things like different races or ethnicities or gender and stereotypes that we make about people. But I think there's something to be learned from some of that and just the dialogue that we have with people. Even if I'm talking with somebody that's the same gender or same race or same background, they still have different perspectives and different life experiences. And if I'm working with an engineer, or I'm working with a business leader, is thinking about where do they come from and their perspective. And some of that you can't really get out of books, right? Some of that is just life experiences and being open and curious and having lots of conversations with different people to see those different experiences and backgrounds. I've had the fortune of being able to travel to different countries and work with GORE and facilities in many different places, and that teaches you and just helps you to learn and see how different people think, and that there are different ways that people think, right? People don't all think the same way. And as you start to see some of those different ways, it empowers you to be able to have those questions. And it really starts with curiosity, questions, and asking questions and spending time in dialogue and understanding.
Okay, yeah. Well, I just wanted to let you know we've actually had there's a lot of good questions are coming in, but we're about out of time. So why don't we see about maybe we're going to be posting the video on YouTube. And so maybe we can look at some of these questions and then we can write up our response to go along with the post to try to address some of these questions. Thank you so much, Willis, for giving a talk. I think this has been a really informative talk. I think a lot of what you said has really resonated with me, and I really enjoyed the interactive element of the talk. And so I'd also like to thank all of our attendees watching the webinar and to the future people who will watch this video on YouTube. So thank you very much for attending our webinar and for speaking at our webinar.
I'm glad to do it. Thank you everyone for participating.
Okay, thanks. Bye.